A white judge tried to humiliate a black man in court, mocked his voice, dismissed his rights, treated him like he didn't belong. The prosecutor joined in, the bailiff got rough. They thought he was just another nobody. But seconds later, he dropped something on the floor, and the courtroom would never see him the same again. What happens when the man they tried to break is actually a Navy SEAL with nothing left to lose? If that hit you, like, share, and stay with us. The full story begins now. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights before you even saw the courtroom. That cold, clinical kind of silence, like everything had already been decided before anyone said a word. Jalen Ross stood just outside the double doors for a moment longer than most men would. Not because he was unsure of what he came for, but because he knew exactly what kind of room he was walking into. It wasn't his first time there. Years ago, he sat in the back row as a quiet young man in uniform, helplessly watching a judge strip his little brother of a future. Marcus Ross had been 20 at the time, full of nerve, full of ideas, and gone within months of that verdict. Jalen had buried him and a part of himself not long after, but this time was different. This time, Jalen wasn't just a witness. He was here to speak, and he wasn't going to let them erase him as easily as they had erased Marcus. The doors opened with that familiar creak. Officer Trent Maddox, tall, white, and already smirking, didn't bother to make eye contact as he waved Jalen forward. His fingers pressed firmly into Jalen's shoulder as they passed the front pews. It wasn't violent, not technically, but it wasn't professional either. It was just enough for Jalen to know exactly where he stood in that man's mind, beneath him. Jalen didn't flinch. He just moved forward, straight-backed and silent, like a man walking into a battlefield where the shots were fired with looks instead of bullets. The judge hadn't even taken the bench yet, but people in the gallery were already whispering. Mostly older white residents, local contractors, maybe some officials from zoning. They didn't recognize Jalen, but they recognized his skin, and that was enough. Another one of them trying to take back what they already lost. One man muttered just loud enough for his row to hear. A woman beside him let out a scoff that carried across the room, and then the door opened again. Judge Beverly Landon stepped into the chamber like she owned more than the bench. Short, severe, and sharply dressed, she didn't smile as she climbed the steps to her chair. Her eyes scanned the room like she was checking for loose wires. When they landed on Jalen sitting calmly at the defendant's table, something flickered. Not surprise, not recognition, just irritation. She picked up the case file, flipped once, and exhaled through her nose. "Mr. Ross," she said, dragging the name just slightly. "Another land dispute, I see. Let's try to keep this one brief, shall we?" Jalen didn't respond. He didn't need to. His stillness was its own kind of statement. At that moment, the side door creaked open. Rachel Ross entered the room in a hurry, clutching a slim file under her arm. Mid-30s, black and dressed simply but sharply, she moved quickly toward the defense table and stopped short when she saw who was sitting there. "Jalen," she said, just above a whisper. He looked up at her calm as ever. No smile. Just a nod. She hadn't seen him in years. Not since their aunt's funeral. And now here he was, unrepresented, unannounced, and standing alone against a room full of people who'd decided who he was before he even spoke. Rachel swallowed, moved beside him, and took her seat without another word. As the bailiff called the court to order, the judge tapped her gavel and leaned forward. "Let the record show," she said, "that the defendant is here representing himself, and that public counsel has arrived late. Please keep your statements concise. We have no time for dramatics." No one said a word, but the message was clear. Jalen was here to ask for something. They were here to make sure he didn't get it. And from the way everyone watched him from the gallery, from the bench, even from the prosecution's table, you could tell they didn't see a man. They saw a problem. But Jalen had been here before. And this time he didn't come to be silenced. He came to be seen. It didn't take long for the air in that courtroom to thicken. The kind of stillness that isn't quiet, it's loaded. You could feel it the moment Jalen stood up, file in hand, and began laying out his clay. He didn't stumble, didn't search for words, just spoke plainly like a man who knew what he was owed. The title documents the tax history, the witness affidavit from the neighbor down the street. It was all there, clean, legitimate. But by the time he'd gotten through his second sentence, the judge was already cutting in. "Mr. Ross," she said flat and firm, "do you believe you're a licensed attorney?" Jalen paused. Not because he was caught off guard, but because he wanted to be sure he heard her correctly. "No, Your Honor," he replied calmly, "but I believe I have the right to present my own defense." Judge Landon sighed, not like someone who was tired, but like someone who wanted the room to see just how tired she was of dealing with men like him. She didn't hide it. Didn't have to. The robe gave her all the cover she needed. At the prosecution's table, Cynthia Lancaster straightened her stack of papers and rose to her feet. Her voice, smooth as glass, cut through the silence like it had somewhere better to be. "Your Honor," she said, "we've reviewed the defendant's submission. It's incomplete, outdated, and frankly misleading. Mr. Ross seems to think that a few photocopied pages and a personal sense of injustice entitle him to ignore decades of zoning policy." Then she turned just slightly enough for the jury box to see her smile. "And let's be honest, Mr. Ross appears to believe that silence and sorrow are somehow substitutes for legal standing." The line landed. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery. Jalen didn't blink. He just turned his head toward her, calm and measured, and spoke. "No, ma'am," he said, "but I do believe truth should count for something." It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but the room shifted when he said it, like a thread had been pulled. Cynthia lowered her chin, her smile fading just enough to betray a hint of unease. Officer Maddox, who had been standing still with arms folded, took a step forward and grabbed a folder off the clerk's table. He walked over to Jalen, leaned down, and dropped the file on the defense table. Not placed, not handed, dropped. It hit the wood with a sharp slap that echoed across the floor. Jalen didn't react, just looked up slowly, locked eyes with Maddox, and spoke in the same voice he'd used in the field when a junior soldier needed a correction without a scene. "You already have the badge," he said, quiet but precise. "No need to prove it this way." Rachel shifted in her seat. She'd been silent until now, watching, listening, noting every flicker of body language in that room. But the way Maddox smirked as he stepped back, the ease of it, made her skin tighten. She glanced at Judge Landon, expecting a reprimand. Nothing. Not even a glance in Maddox's direction. The message was loud and clear. This wasn't just personal. It was institutional. Rachel scribbled something into her notepad, then stopped halfway. She wasn't taking notes anymore. She was building a record. The judge leaned forward again, tapping her gavel once, as if to remind the room who controlled the rhythm. "Let the record show," she said, "that the defendant has shown signs of evasiveness and subtle resistance to courtroom protocol. I am instructing additional monitoring for any further disruptions." Jalen exhaled slowly but didn't argue. He didn't need to, because everyone in that room heard the truth of what just happened. They couldn't disprove his documents. They couldn't dismiss his logic. So now they were trying to discredit his presence. They wanted him angry. They wanted him loud. They wanted a scene. But Jalen wasn't here to give them one. He was here to hold the line quietly, firmly, and without flinching. And maybe that's what unsettled them most. The courtroom emptied slowly during the recess, but the silence lingered like smoke. Rachel stayed behind with Jalen at the defense table, both of them still facing the empty bench. No one spoke for a while. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said out loud or otherwise. When Rachel finally turned to him, her voice was quieter than it had been in years. "Why didn't you hire a private attorney?" Jalen didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the bench, on the seal above the judge's chair, on the flag folded stiff in the corner. Then he let out a soft breath, like someone steadying himself to walk across broken glass. "Because I came to see if justice here still has ears." It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even bitter. It was the kind of answer that came from someone who had long since given up on outrage and learned how to live with silence. Rachel looked at him differently then. She'd known Jalen growing up, remembered him as the quiet, observant older cousin who always had a book under his arm and never said more than he had to. But something about the way he sat now, composed, not passive, told her he'd spent years learning how to survive in rooms like this. She looked down at her notes, then back at him. "This isn't just about land, is it?" Jalen didn't smile, but there was a shift in his expression. His voice dropped lower, steadier, like he was no longer talking to her but to the memory itself. "No, it's about what happened in this room 15 years ago." He paused. "They sat Marcus right where I'm sitting now. Not because he broke any law, but because he raised his voice when the city tried to force Mom out of our home. They said he trespassed. Said he interfered with zoning enforcement. But what he did was stand on the porch she raised us on and refused to move. Rachel didn't interrupt. She just listened. They made him sound like a threat, and this courtroom believed it. They took the house, gave him a misdemeanor, and let the city bulldoze it. He never recovered, never believed anything made sense again after that. Jalen's hands were clasped loosely in front of him, but his knuckles had gone pale. He left town 6 months later. Took a job driving long haul. One rainy night on I-40, his brakes locked up. That was it. Rachel felt something in her throat tighten. She'd heard the story, but never like this. Never from the inside. I was deployed when the hearing happened. Jalen continued, halfway across the world in uniform trying to save people I'd never met. And my little brother was here on his own getting buried under lies while I carried a flag on my shoulder that promised justice. He looked at her, then finally meeting her eyes. You know what Marcus said to me on our last call? Rachel shook her head. He said, they don't hear me, Jay, they never did. The words didn't echo, they landed. Soft but heavy like sand settling into stone. Rachel felt her grip on her pen loosen without realizing. I'm not here, Jalen said, because I think I'll win. I'm here because they need to see what they did. I want that bench, that seal, and every person sitting in this room to remember that they looked a black man in the eye and chose to silence him again. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her chest tight, her pulse a little quicker than before. She'd gone through law school believing the courtroom was where logic beat noise, where facts cut through fear, where justice might move slow, but it moved. But sitting next to Jalen, seeing how carefully he carried every word, how measured every silence was, she realized this wasn't a room of reason. Not for men like him. This was a room where control wore a robe, and fairness waited outside the door. And suddenly her role here felt heavier, not just as a lawyer, but as the only other black voice in that courtroom. She didn't say anything more, just nodded once, not for him, but for the promise she was beginning to make inside herself. Across the aisle, the doors creaked open. The bailiff had returned. Recess was ending. The bench would be occupied again. The games would resume. But something had shifted in the room that couldn't be undone. Jalen hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't shouted. But every word he'd spoken had hit like a hammer on stone. And for the first time that morning, Rachel wasn't just defending a client. She was standing beside a man who'd come to court not to win, but to make the system look at its own reflection. The courtroom resumed as if nothing had cracked in the air. Same judge, same rules, same weight pressing down from invisible walls. But Jalen knew better. This wasn't a room that forgot. It remembered exactly what it wanted and erased the rest. Judge Landon tapped the gavel once sharp and brisk. No kindness in her tone. No patience either. We'll now hear from the prosecution. Cynthia Lancaster stood, her tailored suit as crisp as her words. She didn't look at Jalen. She didn't need to. Her voice was aimed squarely at the jury and at the story they were being told to believe. Your Honor, upon further review of both the property dispute and the defendant's prior involvement in civil complaints, we find ourselves facing a repeated pattern. The Ross family historically has demonstrated a tendency to disrupt legal process, disregard zoning laws, and resist civil enforcement. This is not coincidence, it's behavior. She paused, deliberately scanning the room. This is a man from a family that sees boundaries as invitations to push, and today is no exception. Jalen sat still, hands folded, jaw set. He didn't blink. He didn't twitch. But the courtroom full of watchers who didn't know him had already begun to see something that wasn't there. Rachel leaned slightly forward in her seat, already feeling the room shift under Cynthia's words. Not because they were true, but because they were packaged so well. Jalen stood slowly. Not defiantly, not timidly. Just steady like a man who had walked through storms heavier than this room could ever hold. If defending your home is aggression, he said, clearly, what do you call stealing it? The silence that followed was brief but real. Cynthia didn't respond. She didn't have to. Because Officer Maddox, standing a few feet behind, let his voice break the moment. Well, if looks could kill, he said it to no one but loud enough for the clerk's mic to catch. Landon seized it instantly. Let the record show the defendant has displayed prolonged and aggressive eye contact with court personnel, including conduct perceived as threatening. This will be added to the formal notes of the hearing. Rachel stood before she had time to think. Your Honor, respectfully, there's been no threatening behavior. The defendant has remained calm. He hasn't raised his voice, hasn't made a single disruptive gesture. Landon's eyes narrowed. Counsel, if you interrupt this bench again, I will hold you in contempt. Please sit. Rachel sat, but the weight of that command sat deeper than her spine. She realized then that this courtroom didn't need loud voices to choke someone. It didn't need chains or cuffs. It had paperwork. It had tone. It had erasure that sounded like process. Jalen didn't react to the comment, didn't even turn around. He stared straight ahead, the corners of his mouth tight, but unmoved. He'd been in rooms like this before, overseas, in debriefs, in strategy meetings where men in suits chose whose lives had value based on what map they lived on. This wasn't different. They weren't trying to find the truth. They were trying to write him into a story they'd already prepared, and all he had to do was breathe the wrong way for it to stick. Rachel watched something twisting in her gut. It wasn't just that the system was flawed, it was precise. It knew how to frame silence as defiance and how to twist dignity into disobedience. This wasn't the first Ross to sit here accused of disrupting order by daring to demand fairness. 15 years ago, Marcus had sat in that same seat, arms trembling, voice too small to matter. He hadn't even raised it. He'd just tried to explain. And somehow, that had been enough to label him aggressive. Now Jalen was here, not shouting, not fighting, just standing his ground. And the room was doing it again, writing over his posture, his restraint, his silence, turning it into tension, framing his calm as calculation. The brilliance of it all was how clean it looked. No yelling, no pushing. Just a legal narrative so well-oiled no one questioned the slant. Rachel felt her hands tighten over her notes. She glanced sideways at Jalen, who hadn't moved. And in that stillness, she saw something she couldn't name, but it scared her. Not because he was losing, but because he'd expected it. And that's what broke her heart the most. He hadn't walked in expecting fairness. He'd walked in knowing he'd be turned into a problem. Again. And yet he came anyway. Rachel hadn't meant to dig, at least not that deep. She had only opened the public records to get a clearer view of the land deed history, hoping to find something, anything that could strengthen Jalen's case. But the file was eerily light. There were no citations, no prior complaints, no history of legal disruptions, contrary to the prosecutor's bold claim about the Ross family's pattern of defiance. Rachel scrolled slower. Still nothing. No social media, no news coverage. It was as if Jalen had spent years actively erasing himself, until she hit one small link at the bottom of a local archive, dated 6 years ago. A military blog reposted by a small-town outlet. SEAL Hero Rescues. Lives in Syria. One of them just 4 years old. Rachel clicked, heart skipping. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, and when it finally came into view, there was no doubt. It was Jalen. He looked younger then, leaner, his jaw a little tighter. In the photo, he stood just off the ramp of a rescue helicopter, desert wind whipping through his fatigues. A small child clung to his shoulder. His face didn't beam like the others. He wasn't posing for the camera. He was tired, like someone who had done what needed to be done and didn't need to explain it. Rachel leaned back, breath-catching. This wasn't just some quiet man with a claim about land and justice. This was a decorated combat veteran, a Navy SEAL who had walked through fire and carried others out with him. And not a soul in that courtroom knew. Not the judge, not the cop, not the prosecutor, because Jalen hadn't told them. She printed the article, slid it into a folder, and stepped quietly into the hallway where Jalen sat alone, his shoulders hunched slightly. Not from weakness, but from the weight of something older than this case. Rachel held the printout in her hand but didn't hand it over just yet. "You didn't think to mention this?" she asked softly. Not accusing, just stunned. Jalen didn't even look up. "If I need to wear a uniform for them to listen," he said, "then that's not justice. That's theater." The silence between them stretched, not empty, but full. Full of history, of choices, of moments that were never explained, just carried. Rachel finally sat beside him. "I thought I knew what kind of man you were," she said. "But this is something else." He looked at her then. No pride, no defensiveness, just a man who had long ago stopped expecting anyone to understand. "I'm not here to be honored," he said. "I'm here to finish what Marcus started. Quiet doesn't mean soft. And walking away from a fight doesn't mean you lost it. She nodded, slowly, the folder still in her lap, and something shifted inside her. Until now, she had seen Jalen as brave, yes. Composed, sure. But this moment reframed everything. He wasn't just brave. He was built from something quieter, harder, more durable than defiance. He was resilience that didn't ask to be seen, and Rachel realized that every time he stood silent under a gavel, it wasn't because he had no voice. It was because he had already screamed in places none of them could imagine. And now he measured justice not in noise, but in what he refused to surrender. She didn't press him further, didn't ask about medals or rank. She simply slipped the article back into her bag and held onto it tightly. Like a card she knew she'd need to play, but only when the moment demanded it. Because something in the air told her it wasn't over. Something bigger was coming. There was something different in the air that morning. Not louder, not faster, but tighter. Like the tension in the room had curled itself into a fist waiting to land. Jalen stood at the defendant's table, spine straight, eyes forward. He hadn't said much all morning, just quiet, measured responses, one or two nods, a glance toward Rachel when the prosecution twisted another detail beyond recognition. But that silence, they were done tolerating it. Judge Landon leaned into her mic, voice flat but final. This court is moving to file a temporary detention order against the defendant, Jalen Ross, citing sustained passive aggression and non-compliance with court protocol. Bailiff, proceed. It was the kind of decision made not with facts, but with posture. Rachel's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defendant has complied fully. You're punishing him for not reacting the way you want. Landon didn't even look at her. You are dangerously close to contempt, counselor. Sit down. But Rachel didn't sit, not right away, because Maddox was already moving. He didn't rush, but he didn't hesitate either. He walked like he'd been waiting for this, like it was the part of the job he took personally. Rachel stepped in front of Jalen, arms half raised, not blocking, just human. This doesn't need to happen. Maddox's hand brushed her shoulder as he passed, not hard but firm enough to shove the message home. She stumbled, caught herself, turned, but by then Maddox was standing inches from Jalen, hand on his belt, eyes already scanning for where to grab first. Jalen didn't flinch. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Then he stepped forward. Just a single step. Not threatening, not pleading. Just enough. And then his voice came low. Not a growl, not a shout. Just steady. You really need the cuffs to win this. The room held its breath. Maddox didn't answer. He just reached forward. And that's when it happened. A leather wallet tucked too tight in Jalen's back pocket shifted with the motion of his body. It flipped, caught the edge of the table, and something small, hard, official-looking slid out and clattered to the floor. The room froze. Rachel blinked, then moved. She crouched instinctively, fingers closing around a laminated rectangle. And when she read it, she didn't stand slowly. She stood like the ground had shifted under her feet. Lieutenant Jalen Ross, she said, voice shaking but rising with every word. United States Navy SEAL, Bronze Star for Valor. Honorable discharge, clearance level 5. She turned to the judge. Are we still pretending this man is a threat to your courtroom? The silence that followed was louder than any gavel. Judge Landon didn't respond. She stared at the ID in Rachel's hand as if it were radioactive. Cynthia Lancaster's mouth had parted slightly, but no words came out. Maddox lowered his hand slowly, backing off not out of guilt, but confusion. Like someone who'd pulled the wrong lever and didn't know how to unpull it. Rachel stepped closer to the bench. He didn't tell anyone. Didn't wave it in your face. Because he didn't come here for recognition. He came here to be heard. And instead you tried to cage him. She turned toward the jury box, eyes sweeping across their stunned faces. This is who you were trying to paint as dangerous. This is the man you claimed had a history of disruption. He served in places none of us can imagine. Carried people out of burning buildings halfway across the world. But here today you made him the problem. The room didn't stir. No coughs, no whispers. Just one slow inhale, collective tight as the image of who Jalen Ross truly was finally burned itself into the minds of everyone watching. And still Jalen hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he was, silent, still. But this time the silence was louder than anything else in the room, and it wasn't submission, it was power. The courtroom didn't breathe. Maddox's hand froze, mid-air fingers half curled like he'd forgotten what they were supposed to do. Then slowly, awkwardly, he stepped back, not out of respect, Not even out of fear, but because the room itself had shifted. The air had grown too dense to walk through the same way. Rachel still held the ID badge up, but her voice was now steady, unshaken. This man, she said, was the lead officer on Operation Sandlight. He pulled 9 civilians, 3 of them children, out of a compound minutes before it was leveled by artillery. He refused the Distinguished Service Cross because he said it belonged to his team. He asked to be reassigned quietly without ceremony. You didn't know that because he never told you. She looked directly at Judge Landon then, and even from the gallery you could see it, the way Landon's mouth twitched ever so slightly as if her gavel had suddenly turned to glass in her hand. Rachel didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead of honoring that silence, this court tried to shame it, tried to turn it into evidence. You saw a man who didn't shout, who didn't argue, who didn't bow, and you thought that meant he had no weight. Jalen hadn't moved, but when he finally did speak, his words carried like a slow tide cutting through stone. I served in places none of you would ever dare to go, he said, not with pride, but precision. Not for medals, not for parades. I carried men back who didn't make it. I watched children die because we were 2 minutes too late. I buried brothers who never saw their own names again. He paused, looked to Rachel, then forward. But I came back here today for Marcus. His voice didn't crack. It didn't tremble, but it landed with something heavier than rage. For the brother this court erased. For the boy you convicted without cause. For the son my mother buried while I was halfway across the world doing what you called heroic. Only to come home and be told my silence looks like threat. Every juror stared, even the ones who moments before had nodded when the prosecutor suggested patterned behavior. Now not a sound. Cynthia Lancaster, the prosecutor who'd been sharp smiling, certain was pale. Her eyes darted to her notes to Jalen, back to Landon, but she didn't say a word, because there was nothing left to spin. And Landon looked like someone who'd heard a verdict for the first time in her career and realized it was for her. She fumbled with her robe, slightly fingers clumsy, her lips parted then closed. When she finally spoke, the words were thin, lighter than her usual iron tone. This hearing will stand in recess, she said. The court will take time to verify credentials presented. Until then, all proceedings are temporarily paused. It was the first time in the entire trial that her voice wavered. No gavel, no authority, just the sound of something losing control in real time. Rachel gently lowered the ID. The room remained still, like it was waiting for permission to exhale. Jalen didn't look at anyone. He simply turned, walked back to his seat, and sat down, as if to say, I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. And in that silence, something deeper than outrage filled the air. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about reckoning. The moment Rachel lifted the badge into the light, it was as if every breath in the courtroom was swallowed by the silence. Maddox's hands, once firm and ready to clamp down, froze mid-air and slowly fell back to his sides. The air around him changed, like even he realized he had crossed an invisible line. Judge Landon blinked twice, her posture stiffening, but her eyes flickered just for a second toward the seal on that ID. And Cynthia Lancaster, who had built her argument on mockery, went utterly still, her pen frozen over her notes. Rachel's voice didn't shake, but her hands did. Lieutenant Jalen Ross, Navy SEAL, Bronze Star, 2 tours in Afghanistan, Rescue Commander, Operation Nightwind, Syria. She didn't read from a document. She had memorized it. Every word felt carved out of respect, fury, and disbelief all at once. Jalen didn't move. He didn't need to. He simply looked up, his eyes steady, his jaw set, not angry, not smug, just tired. Tired in the way people get when they've carried dignity through hell and are still expected to bow when they return home. I served where none of you dared to go, he said quietly. But today, I came back. For Marcus. That name, Marcus, hung in the air like a ghost summoned by truth. Not just a name, but a wound reopened in public view. The courtroom sat with it. No one spoke. Even the cough stopped. Even the AC unit humming above seemed to hesitate. Rachel lowered the badge slightly but didn't put it away. She kept it close to her chest like a shield, one that suddenly felt necessary. Her throat tightened with emotion she hadn't planned to feel. Pride, guilt. Some impossible mix of both. She had defended countless clients before, but never had she felt this furious at a courtroom that had judged a man without knowing the fire he'd walked through. From the back of the courtroom, a woman shifted uneasily. A man beside her rubbed his brow head low. No one dared to look at Jalen directly, and yet no one could look away. Something had shifted, not just in perception, but in power. Maddox backed off slowly, his hands now gripping the back of the wooden pew like it could anchor him. Landon sat back down slowly like her knees weren't sure how to hold her anymore. Her fingers traced the edge of the bench, then dropped to her lap. She was looking at something, but no one knew what. Maybe not even her. Rachel turned to her. "We're not here for pity," she said clearly. He came to ask if justice in this place still had ears. Maybe now someone should start listening. It should have been a mic drop moment, but no one even breathed hard enough to let a pin drop. Cynthia Lancaster scribbled something quickly, but even she didn't look up. Her usual smirk was gone. Instead, her eyes scanned the room like she had just realized she might be on the wrong side of history. Landon's lips parted, searching for words that didn't come. She cleared her throat once, then twice before finally speaking. "The court will recess for verification of submitted credentials and reassessment of procedural conduct." Her voice didn't carry the usual sharp edge. It cracked on reassessment. And when she looked down at her gavel, she didn't slam it. She tapped it softly, almost like she was afraid of making too much noise. Rachel felt at first a shift so subtle it almost wasn't real. But the silence hadn't just fallen. It had landed hard on everyone who had chosen to stay blind. This wasn't just a man with a badge. This was a man who had been humiliated, tested, pushed to the edge, and still hadn't raised his voice. And that silence, his silence, now roared louder than any defense could. She looked over at Jalen, who hadn't moved a muscle. His gaze wasn't fixed on Landon anymore. It wasn't on Maddox or Cynthia or even Rachel. It was on the seat where Marcus once sat years ago, trying to explain why he wasn't guilty while no one listened. And now, through that silence, Marcus was being heard. Rachel swallowed hard. They didn't just try to handcuff a veteran. They tried to bury a truth that refused to stay quiet. She slipped the ID badge into her case folder gently, like it was something sacred. Then she turned to Jalen. He gave the smallest nod, just enough for her to know this wasn't over. Not yet. From the gallery someone stood. Just one person. No applause. No outburst. Just a quiet act of witnessing. Then another followed. And then another. It wasn't protest. It wasn't ceremony. It was a room full of people realizing they had almost watched dignity be erased, and now they had to live with how close it came to happening. Judge Landon watched the crowd stand one by one, and for the first time all day, she didn't say a word to stop it. And just like that, the courtroom didn't belong to her anymore. Jalen didn't storm out. He didn't run. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had just stripped the mask off an entire courtroom and dared it to react. No cuffs, no bailiff on his heels, just silence following his every step like an audience too stunned to applaud. Maddox stepped aside before Jalen even reached the aisle. He didn't say a word, didn't look up. The man who hours ago shoved Jalen through the door now stood statue still because he understood. Power had shifted, and it didn't belong to him anymore. Rachel remained seated, the weight of the last few minutes settling in her chest like a fire refusing to burn out. In her hands was the photo of Marcus Young, proud, trusting. A boy who had walked into this same courtroom, hoping for fairness, and left in silence. That silence had taken years to break, but today it cracked the marble. She stared up at the massive carved words behind the bench Justice Center. Her jaw tightened. "You think this place will change?" she asked aloud, more bitter than hopeful. Jalen didn't turn around. His voice came through the open doors, clear, heavy, and without illusion. "No," he said. "But someone watching today will." And with that, he disappeared through the doorway. But the echo of his words stayed behind, bouncing off the cold stone walls like a verdict the judge hadn't dared deliver. Upstairs in her chambers, Judge Landon stood frozen before the mirror. Her robe still on her hand, still gripping the gavel like it might anchor her to something solid. But the weight had changed. That piece of wood didn't symbolize authority anymore. It symbolized collapse. The image staring back at her in the mirror was no longer a figure of control. It was a woman exposed. And for the first time in her career, she didn't know how to rebuild what had just shattered. She slammed the gavel down on her desk, not out of order, but out of panic. The sound was hollow. The echo didn't command. It begged for reassurance. But the room gave her none. Down the hallway, Cynthia Lancaster sat rigid in her office, hands trembling over a stack of case notes. Her eyes darted to the closed door as if expecting it to burst open with cameras and consequences. She clutched the file labeled Ross v. County and stared at it like it had turned radioactive. Everything she had built her prosecution on dismissive tone, coded language, tactical pressure had unraveled in front of a room full of witnesses. She had mocked a man who had risked his life for strangers overseas, while she had weaponized doubt for a living. For a moment she reached for her phone, then stopped. What could she say? That she didn't know. That she didn't see it coming. She had seen it. She just didn't care until the silence got louder than her voice. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Jalen stood still on the steps, not speaking to press, not making a show. He wasn't posing for justice. He was waiting for it to catch up. The crowd had started to grow. A few reporters, a couple of cell phones raised. Whispers began circulating, not from a press release, but from those who had sat inside and seen a system blink. The photo of his badge, the name, the gavel that didn't fall. Rachel stepped outside, her heels clicking sharply against the stone like punctuation to the storm that had just passed. She didn't speak right away, just stood beside Jalen and watched the courthouse doors that had once closed people out, now holding guilt behind them. "They're going to spin it," she finally said. "Make you the manipulator, the aggressor. They can try," Jalen replied, his tone steel calm. But they lost control the moment they reached for the cuffs. He turned to her slowly, eyes not tired but sharpened. "Now let's see what they grab next." Behind them, the courthouse stood still. But inside, everything was scrambling, and for the first time they knew it. Cynthia sat alone in her office long after the courtroom had emptied. The lights overhead hummed softly, but she barely noticed. Her laptop screen still displayed the article, "SEAL Hero Rescues 9 in Syrian Compound." The face in the photo looked nothing like the man they tried to humiliate. And yet it was him, Jalen Ross. She reached slowly for a folder in her drawer, Marcus Ross. She hadn't touched it in years. Back then, she was new to the district. Still idealistic. Still believing she could work the system from within. Marcus had come in scared. Not belligerent, not arrogant, just scared. He had asked for time. A chance to find a public defender. A chance to call his brother. But the docket was full. The judge was impatient. Cynthia said nothing. There had been a moment, one brief moment, where she could have spoken up. She remembered the words forming in her throat, but she swallowed them. Just one case, she told herself. It's not personal. It's protocol. Now, opening that file again, the silence in the room pressed down on her like a weight. There on the final page was the last motion Marcus had written himself. Handwritten. Sloppy, but sincere. He had asked to postpone the ruling. Said he didn't feel safe going back home. She never read that motion, never even saw it. It had gone straight into the pile of dismissed documents. A message blinked across her phone screen. It was from Rachel. Just one line. "You don't lose your soul in one choice. You lose it every time you stay silent." There was no anger in the words, no accusation, but Cynthia felt it cut sharper than anything shouted at her in court. She looked toward her bookshelf where a framed photo still sat untouched. Law school graduation. Her younger self stood in the middle of a crowd holding a cardboard sign that read, "Justice has no color." Her eyes back then had been wide and bright, unafraid, uncompromised. Cynthia turned the photo down, face to the desk. No one had asked her to apologize. No one had confronted her. And yet, she had never felt more exposed. For the first time in years, she couldn't hide behind policy or precedent. She saw clearly now not just who Jalen was, but who she had become. Not a villain, but something quieter, and maybe worse. She closed the Marcus Ross file gently. Not to bury it again, but because she wasn't done with it yet. Not this time. Then she sat back, let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, and stared at the silent room around her. Sometimes the loudest conviction is the one you pronounce on yourself. Jalen sat alone on the granite steps of the courthouse, elbows resting on his knees, head tilted slightly toward the fading sun. The ID badge clipped to his hip-seal trident glinting in the amber light didn't draw attention the way it had inside. Out here, it was just a sliver of metal, quiet, ordinary, but somehow it shimmered like it had more to say than anyone inside ever had. He wasn't waiting on anyone. He wasn't running from anything. He just sat. Rachel came down the steps slowly, her heels tapping against the stone, then quieted as she neared him. She didn't sit right away, just stood beside him a moment, watching his gaze trace the sidewalk where people filtered out in hushed tones. Eyes lowered, brows furrowed, shoulders heavy. Then she asked, "Did you get justice today?" Jalen didn't answer immediately. He let the air settle between them like he was giving the question space to land properly. Then finally he said quietly, "No, but I saw it flinch. That's enough for today." Rachel sat next to him. She didn't offer comfort, and he didn't ask for any. They just shared the quiet. Two people who had walked through fire and come out singed but still walking. Around them, the courthouse no longer looked like a fortress. It looked tired. The pillars, once so rigid and cold, seemed to sag a little in the afternoon light. Not broken, but not untouchable either. They watched as Officer Maddox slipped out the side exit, head ducked, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He didn't wear the same swagger. Even the prosecutors left quieter than they arrived, folders clutched close, not like weapons now, but like burdens. Inside, Judge Landon still hadn't left the bench. No one could say what she was thinking. But something in the air had shifted. Even silence, when you've forced it long enough, eventually echoes back at you. Rachel glanced over at Jalen, her voice softer this time. "You think it'll change anything?" He looked forward again toward the street where a group of students passed, some of them having watched the hearing from the back row. He nodded slightly. "Maybe not in there," he said, meaning the courtroom behind them. "But someone out here saw it, felt it. That's how it starts." They sat like that for a while, watching the world resume its rhythm, but not quite as before. The courthouse door still stood. The system hadn't crumbled. But for the first time, it had hesitated. It had looked into the face of someone it tried to erase and flinched. The narrator's voice returns gentle but unwavering. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he didn't kneel, but he made the court bend. And in a world where too many bend first, that was no small thing. Some stories aren't told to change the world overnight. They're told to remind us that dignity doesn't always shout, but when it stands its ground, even silence carries power. Today's story wasn't just about a Navy SEAL or a courtroom. It was about presence, about truth, and about how justice sometimes begins with simply being seen. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who still believes in justice, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful human stories like this one. Your support gives our team the strength to keep creating stories that speak for those who've been unheard for too long. This is Mr. Mac's Stories, where the truth stands tall even in the quietest moments.